They sharpened pencils with the same axes. Then the soldiers went into the forest and chopped woods for piles. The construction of one bridge took 4 days. The bridge could bear a weight of 10 tons. Its construction was a real feat. Formations of the 13th Army of the Central Front and the 3rd Guard Tank Army of the Voronezh Front were the first to approach the Dnieper by Большая Bukria to the north of River Pripyat. Later, formations of 19 more armies seized 22 bridgeheads. Moreover, 2 bridgeheads were seized on the right bank of the Pripyat. The Soviet troops managed to hold onto these bridgeheads and to enlarge them. The Soviet troops liberated almost the entire left bank Ukraine, the entire Donbass, and approached the Dnieper. They managed to defeat about 30 enemy divisions along the front 750 kilometers long from the city of Lviv to Zaporozhye. The fiercest battle took place on the course of crossing the Dnieper to the north of Kiev by the village of Lutizh. The Soviet troops fought heroically on the right bank holding onto the seized bridgehead. The 5th Guard Rank Corps went to their rescue. Another river, Desna, stood on their way. They had no time to build bridges, so the tankmen decided to cross the river by the bottom, though the depth was twice the admissible. They stuffed all the cracks in the machines and hatches with oiled cloths. The muffler tubes were covered with tarpaulin and raised above the water. The tankmen drove their tanks blindly, listening to the commanders who supervised the crossing of the tank barges above the water. 60 tanks T-34 crossed the Desna in a day. To liberate Kiev, the 1st Ukrainian Front's command planned to strike a decisive blow from the Bukrin bridgehead 60 kilometers away. In October, they launched the offensive twice, but the enemy was too strong. That's why it was decided to attack not from Bukrin, but from the Lutizh bridgehead and to advance towards the south from there. At night, our tanks started to move from the Bukrin bridgehead to the left bank of the Dnieper. On the left bank, they passed 200 kilometers to the south and crossed the river to the Lutizh bridgehead again. They did it so skillfully and carefully that the enemy failed to notice the maneuver. The Soviet formation that stayed by Bukrin imitated an attempt to break through the enemy lines. In the morning of the 3rd of November, the armies of Generals Chernyakhovsky and Moskalenko outflanked Kiev from the west and went into offensive, taking the enemy by surprise. Fierce battles continued at the Bukrin bridgehead as well. There, the 40th Army of General Zhmachenko, the 27th Army of General Trofimenko, went into offensive 2 days earlier to divert the enemy's attention. In the evening of the 4th of November, the Guard Tank Army of General Rybalko joined in the offensive. The tanks moved with lights and sirens turned on. By the evening, the troops of the 38th Army had reached Kiev suburbs. By midnight, the Soviet troops broke through into the city. By 4 a.m. on the 6th of November, Kiev was liberated. Note: in the course of the Battle of the Dnieper, the Red Army lost over 1.5 million people. According to German data, the losses of Germans at the Soviet-German front from June of 1943 to February 1944, that is almost the entire duration of the battle, amounted to about 1,600,000 people. The Liberation Movement of 1945. By the end of 1943, 257 German divisions out of 376 and 25 tank divisions out of 32 were fighting against the Soviet Army. The Soviet command planned to go into offensive in 1944 at the fronts from the Black to the Baltic Sea, delivering its main blow in the southwest. In January and February of 1944, the Red Army ran Leningrad's siege. By spring, it had carried out a series of major operations and liberated the right bank Ukraine and the Crimea. The Soviet troops approached the Carpathians and entered the territory of Romania. In the course of the winter campaign of 1944, due to the Red Army's attacks, the enemy lost 13 divisions and 6 brigades. That's over 1 million people. The 24th of January, the 17th of February of 1944, Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation. German troops lost 55,000 people killed and 18,000 taken prisoners. May and April of 1944, German troops advanced in the south. Mykolaiv was liberated on the 28th of March, Odessa on the 10th of April. The 8th of April, the 12th of May of 1944, the Crimea was liberated. Note: in 1941-1942, despite the German superiority in machinery, aviation and manpower, Sevastopol held its ground for 250 days. In 1944, the Soviet troops seized the city in 4 days. In March of 1944, after the failure of operations in the south, recent Hitler's favorite Field Marshal Manstein lost his post. After the catastrophe in the Crimea and at the southern Bug, Field Marshal von Kleist met with the same fate. On the 26th of March of 1944, the Soviet troops approached the USSR's borders. In June of 1944, the English and American forces landed in Normandy and in the south of France. The Second Front was opened. In June of 1944, the Soviet troops attacked the Finnish forces. After that, Finland asked for truce, which was accepted on the 19th of September of 1944 in Moscow. The grandiose offensive of the Red Army in Belarus that lasted from the 24th of June to the 29th of August of 1944, and in western Ukraine from the 13th of July to the 29th of August of the same year, resulted in crushing defeats of two major strategic groups of Wehrmacht, taking control over 600 kilometers of the German front and defeating 82 German divisions. In the course of the Belarus operation, the Red Army marched from the Dnieper to the Wisla, leaving 500 to 600 kilometers behind. The Soviet troops liberated the entire Belarus, the majority of Lithuania, and entered the territory of Poland. As a result of the Belarus operation, the Army Group Center was defeated. Wehrmacht lost more than 539,000 people. 380,000 were killed and 158,000 taken prisoners. Losses of the Soviet amounted to 233,000 people. In comparison with other strategic operations of 1944, the Belarus operation cost the Red Army the hugest losses of personnel. On average, it was losing 11,000 people every single day. It is evidence of the fierceness of the battles and of the Germans' desperate resistance. It is confirmed by the fact that the number of Wehrmacht soldiers and officers killed in the course of that operation was 2.5 times higher than the number of people who yielded themselves prisoners. On the 3rd of July, Minsk was liberated. The 13th of July, the 29th of August of 1944, Lviv-Sandomir operation. The Red Army defeated the fascist army group Northern Ukraine. They devastated 32 divisions, annihilating 8 of them completely. They liberated the western regions of Ukraine and southeastern regions of Poland. In the south, in the course of Yassi-Kishinev operation of 1944, the Red Army defeated the army group Southern Ukraine, eliminating 18 divisions. During August and September of 1944, our troops liberated Romania, Bulgaria, and a part of Yugoslavia. Romania and Bulgaria denounced their union with Germany and declared a war on it. The Red Army continued its powerful offensive from July to November of 1944, when it liberated the Baltic states. There, it defeated 26 German divisions of the Army Group's North. The main forces of the group, that consisted of 27 divisions and 1 brigade, were forced back to the Kulansky Peninsula and lost their strategic importance. On the 15th of September of 1944, Finland declared a war on Germany. Note: during 10 months of 1944, the Red Army troops carried out 11 strategic offensive operations, and at the beginning of October they started the 12th one, the Budapest campaign. Every single one of them ended in victory. The Liberation Campaign. The Soviet troops, together with the Romanian and Bulgarian forces, launched their offensive in the Carpathians and in Belgrade and Budapest directions. On the 20th of September of 1944, our troops, together with the Czechoslovak units, crossed the border and started liberation of Czechoslovakia. 1944. From the 28th of September to the 20th of October, the Soviet troops, Liberation Army of Yugoslavia and forces of the Bulgarian front carried out the Belgrade operation. On the 20th of October, Belgrade was liberated by the Soviet troops and units of the Liberation Army. The German army, Group Serbia, was eliminated. German groups F and E suffered a crushing defeat, losing over 100,000 people killed and wounded. 1944. The 7th, 27th of October. At Kirkenes operation. The north of Norway and the entire Kola Peninsula were liberated from Nazis. From the 29th of September 1944 to the 4th of April 1945, Hungary had been liberated from the Hitlerites and the Hungarian troops of Szalasi regime. On the 22nd of December 1944, the Provisional Government of Hungary was founded in the city of Debrecen, liberated from the Germans. It declared a war on Germany and on the 20th of January of 1945 signed a peace treaty with the USSR and its allies in Moscow. On the 13th of February 1945, Budapest was liberated. According to some data, the total losses of the Red Army in 1944 amounted to 6,503,204 people killed, wounded, taken prisoner and sick. Till January of 1945, Germany had 299 divisions and 31 brigades. Among them, 169 German divisions and 20 brigades and 16 Hungarian divisions and 1 brigade fought against the USSR. The Soviet fronts, under the command of Marshals Chernyakhovsky and Rokossovsky, acted in the north. The former advanced from Memele towards the south, and the latter from the river Narov to the north towards eastern Prussia. The troops of Marshals Zhukov and Konyev fought in the center. The troops of the former advanced towards Warsaw and Berlin, and the troops of the latter moved to the Upper Silesia and had to cross the Oder. The fronts of Marshals Malinovsky and Tulbuchin fought in the south. They were ordered to liberate Silesia, seize Budapest, and advance towards Vienna. The troops of General Petrov, that fought between Marshals Malinovsky's and Konyev's fronts, had to drive the Germans out to the northern Carpathians. In total, over 300 divisions and 25 tank armies fought at the 7 fronts. 1945, the 12th of January, the 3rd of February, the Wisla-Oder operation of the Soviet forces. They destroyed 35 German divisions. 25 generals lost from 50 to 70% of their personnel. About 120,000 people were taken prisoners. In the course of the operation, Poland and a considerable part of Czechoslovakia were completely liberated. 1945, the 13th of January, the 25th of April, the Eastern Prussian operation of the Soviet troops. Germans defended Königsberg with fantastic persistence. The city was not fully encircled because of the sea routes from Pillau remained open. On the 1st of February, Chernyakhovsky seized Friedland, and on the 9th of February, Preussisch-Eylau. On the 17th of February, he was mortally wounded. Marshal Vasilevsky took over his post. At the beginning of March, Vasilevsky's troops encircled Königsberg, but the real storm began only on the 18th of April. The next day, the city capitulated. On the 16th of March of 1945, the Vienna offensive of the Soviet troops was launched. On the 13th of April, Vienna was seized. Berlin was the last outpost of the fascist Germany that fell under the Soviet troops' pressure. The Battle of Berlin. From the 16th of April to the 8th of May of 1945, the troops of Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarus Front, Marshal Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarus Front, and Marshal Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Front carried out the Berlin offensive. Some forces of the Baltic Fleet, the long-range aviation, troops of anti-air raid, the Dnipro military flotilla, and the 1st and the 2nd armies of the Polish army were also involved. Over 2.5 million people took part in the attack, having 42,000 cannons and mortars, 6,250 tanks and self-propelled artillery, and 7,500 military planes at their disposal. The German army groups that defended Berlin amounted to about 1 million people, 10,400 cannons and mortars, 1,000 half tanks of storm cannons, and 3,300 military planes. The Berlin Defense District consisted of 3 rings of defense fortifications. All the big buildings in the city were turned into base stations. Streets and squares were blocked by fortified barricades. On the 16th of April of 1945 at 5 a.m., our artillery opened fire at the enemy fortifications. At the same time, 150 powerful searchlights were mounted every 200 meters. They blinded the enemy and prevented it from firing correctly. Marshal Zhukov recalled, "From the very first minutes, Hitler's troops were practically buried under the sea of fire and metal. From the 16th to the 19th of April, the Soviet troops managed to break through the Oder-Nesensk line of the enemy defense. On the 20th of April, the storm of Berlin began. On the 24th of April, the troops of the 1st Belarus and the 1st Ukrainian fronts joined forces at the south and east of the city and divided the enemy group into 2. As a result of the storm, the forces of the 9th German Army and some formations of the 4th Tank Army were cut off Berlin and encircled in the eastern suburbs of the city. On the 25th of April, the troops of the 1st Belarus and 1st Ukrainian fronts met in the area of Ketzen and tightened the ring around Berlin. In such a way, about 200,000 Hitler soldiers were encircled by the German capital and 200,000 people in Berlin itself. On the same day, the troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front met with the 12th American Army Group of General Bradley on the Elbe. Together, they eliminated the enemy in Berlin in the course of fierce street battles. On the 26th of April, the Berlin group was divided into several units. The troops of the 1st Belarus Front approached the city from the west, south and east. The troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front went to meet them from the south and southwest. On the 28th of April, the Berlin group was divided into 3 isolated parts. Fascist German command practically lost its control over their forces. Street battles in Berlin knew no breaks. In the evening of the 30th of April, the Soviet troops stormed Reichstag and raised the victory red flag there. The troops of the 1st Belarus and the 1st Ukrainian fronts managed to liquidate the group encircled in the east of Berlin. When our forces approached the Imperial Chancellery, Hitler committed suicide. On the 1st of May, Habsburg radio station announced about Hitler's death. Gross Admiral Dönitz became the head of the German government. The elimination of the Berlin group lasted till the 2nd of May, when the Hitlerites stopped resistance altogether. On the 2nd of May, Konev sent the last telegram about the Berlin operation to Moscow. Today, on the 2nd of May of 1945, the troops of the front seized the southwestern and central districts of Berlin after 9-day street battles, in frames of a dividing line determined for the front, and together with the troops of the 1st Belarus Front, took control over Berlin. The battle with separate groups trying to break through to the west continued till the 9th of May. On the 8th of May of 1945, representatives of German command signed the Capitulation Act in Karlshorst on unconditional surrender of the joint German forces. At the end of the Berlin operation, over 600 its participants were awarded with the titles of the Hero of the Soviet Union, and 13 of them became the heroes for the second time. In the course of the Berlin operation, the Soviets suffered incredible losses. Over 350,000 people were killed and wounded. 101,961 people were declared missing. Unfortunately, Interchannel cannot tell you about all the military, political and everyday events of that war. We can't name all the villages and cities from Brest to Moscow and from Stalingrad to Berlin, where our soldiers fought for our descendants' right for freedom and life. The most horrible war in the history of mankind lasted 1,418 days and nights. The war.
The War, Episode 11. Guerrilla Movement. The guerrilla movement in the enemy's rear started in the first days of the war. From June to September 1945, 25 underground oblast party committees and 685 region and city committees were created in Ukraine alone. In the non-occupied territory, detachments were formed and personnel trained at special schools. After the training, the detachments either stayed in the regions selected before the occupation or were deployed to the enemy's rear. In August 1941, a special school was created in Kyiv to train personnel for the guerrilla movement. Later, similar schools were founded in Kharkiv, Poltava and Lysychansk. Within a few months, the schools trained around 4,500 underground operatives and guerrilla leaders. The guerrilla movement's major tactic unit was the detachment. In the beginning of the war, a detachment usually numbered several dozens of fighters, later 200 and more. Many detachments amalgamated into brigades, numbering from several hundred to several thousand people. They were armed with mostly light weapons, submachine guns, automatic rifles, ordinary rifles, carabines and grenades. However, many detachments and formations had mortars and heavy machine guns, and some even artillery. Even before the occupation began, 883 detachments and over 1,700 diversionary and reconnaissance groups had been organized for developing the guerrilla movement. A broad network of guerrilla formations had been set up in Dnipropetrovsk, Kyiv, Kirovohrad, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Poltava, Stalino, Sumy, Kharkiv and Chernihiv oblasts. Implementing their Ost plan, the Germans formed a Ukraine Reichskommissariat with Erich Koch as its leader and established an oppressive occupation regime. The situation in the neighboring Belarus, which had become part of the Ostland Reichskommissariat, was much more favorable to its residents. Reichskommissar Wilhelm Kube allowed Belarusians to keep their national language, culture, schools and state symbols. In 1943, Soviet guerrillas killed Kube and Belarus was engulfed in a spate of SS punitive operations against peaceful civilians. This triggered an upsurge of the guerrilla movement. According to the official Soviet data, the guerrilla detachments in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic's territory numbered 501,750 and in Belarus 373,942 people. As early as 1941, guerrilla centers were formed. In Sumy Oblast, it was in the Spatchane forest. That was the cradle of Sigurd Kovbak's partisan detachment. One of Ukraine's biggest guerrilla formations, commanded by Alexei Fedorov, was formed in Chernihiv Oblast. In Rivne Oblast, guerrilla forces consolidated around Dmitro Medvedev's detachment, operating on the outskirts of the oblast center. In western Ukraine, apart from the Soviet underground fighters, OUN detachments were actively operating. In June and July of 1942, the Melnikivtsi troops were functioning in the vicinities of Lutsk, Pochayev, Kremenets and Lanivtsi. A dispatch from People's Commissar of State Security Savchenko to head of the Ukrainian guerrilla movement headquarters Strokach of May the 24th, 1943 reads, a number of sources testify that in spite of the mass repressions against the OUN members, the latter not only failed to stop their activities, but on the contrary, considerably intensified them, having gone underground. The Kharkiv Gestapo report of December 1942 says Ukrainian nationalists have intensified their actions, which is being proved by information coming from everywhere. Their motto, freedom with neither Soviets nor Germans, is on everybody's lips. By the decision of State Defense Committee in June of 1942, an all-Ukrainian guerrilla headquarters were created to unify the partisan leadership. From September to November 1942, it sent to the enemy's rear 59 organizers groups numbering 629 persons. The Kovpak and Saburov guerrilla formations started their raid from eastern to western Ukraine. From November 1942 to April 1943, at the height of the Stalingrad counteroffensive, the guerrillas derailed around 1,500 enemy troop trains. As a result of the guerrilla expansion in Ukraine's territory, in 1942 and 1943, partisan territories and zones were formed. The partisans controlled large regions of Rivne, Sumy, Zhytomyr and Volyn oblasts, south regions of Chernihiv Oblast and adjacent regions of Kyiv Oblast became a guerrilla zone. They were controlled by over 20,000 partisans, forming two divisions operating in the enemy's rear. The War, Episode 12, Guerrilla Movement. In 1942, the Ukrainian insurgents addressed the Red Partisans in leaflets calling on them to join the UAA and fight together against the both imperialistic systems for complete freedom and independence of the enslaved nation-states. Down with Hitler and Stalin. In April 1943, almost all rural areas of Volyn and Podillia were controlled by the insurgents. In May, the Germans started an offensive against the Ukrainian insurgent army. In summer, artillery, tanks and planes were set upon the UAA fighters. In spite of that, their activities even intensified. In July, they launched 295 attacks against the German base stations and 391 in August. 682 acts of sabotage took place on railroads in July and 1,034 in August. July saw 119 and August 151 attacks on economic facilities. The Germans retaliated with large-scale repressions. In the fall of 1943, they executed over 1,500 OUN and UAA members in Halychina alone. The Gestapo set a price of 50,000 German marks on the head of the Bandera OUN leader Mykola Lebedь. Since the summer of 1943, the UAA had to fight on two fronts, against the Red Partisans and the Germans. In the spring of 1944, the first battle against the regular Soviet army took place. The insurgents had ignored Khrushchev's official proposition to lay down arms and suffered great losses. Moscow was constantly coordinating its detachments' actions throughout the occupied territory. The guerrilla movement had a centralized leadership. The War on Rails operation was launched on a massive scale. On its first night, August 3, 1943, the guerrillas demolished over 42,000 rails. Mass explosions lasted throughout August and first half of September. By mid-September, the number of demolished rails amounted to 215,000. September the 19th, a new operation, codenamed Concert, got underway. The Ukrainian and Belarusian guerrillas were joined by partisans from Karelia, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. 193 brigades and detachments, numbering over 120,000, took part in the operation. Within 1943, around 11,000 enemy's trains and bays were demolished. Over 22,000 vehicles destroyed, around 5,500 bridges with highways or dirt roads, and over 900 railway bridges destroyed or burnt down. Assisting in the Red Army's assault, the guerrillas were capturing river passages, liberating settlements and road junctions. In Ukraine, in the course of the Soviet troops' advancement to the Dnipro, the partisans had captured 3 crossings over the Desna River, 10 over the Pripyat and 12 over the Dnipro. After liberating the right bank Ukraine, guerrilla detachments from the disbanded Vasil Bechma and Alexei Fedorov's formations were sent to the occupied regions. The Lviv-Warsaw raid was of great importance for the development of guerrilla movement in western regions. It was carried out by the Kovpak 1st Guerrilla Division, commanded by Petro Vershigora. The UAA detachments attempted negotiating with partisan leaders Kovpak, Brinsky and Saburov, all this to no avail, since the Ukrainian party had been consistently demanding that independent Ukrainian state be restored after the war. Their opponents would not even hear about it. By February of 1944, by order of Ukraine's Communist Party Central Committee, 15 guerrilla formations had been deployed to western oblasts from the right bank Ukraine. In the summer of 1944, when the Red Army was completing the liberation of western Ukraine oblasts, the guerrillas intensified their attacks on the enemy's communications. In 1944, the Ukrainian guerrillas liberated 45 cities, region centers and railway stations and held them until the Soviet troops came. In total, 60 partisan formations and around 2,000 partisan detachments, reconnaissance and diversionary groups were operating in the occupied territory of Ukraine. Their general number amounted to 500,000. In the war years, the Soviet partisans killed, wounded and captured over 1 million Nazis, destroyed over 4,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 1,100 planes, and derailed over 20,000 troop trains. General Guderian wrote, "The guerrilla war has become a true scourge, affecting the soldiers' morale." 95 patriots fighting in the guerrilla regiments in Ukraine alone were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. 183,000 guerrillas were decorated with orders and medals. However, many of them, coming out of the underground, found themselves in the NKVD torture chambers on suspicion of espionage and conspiracy with Germans or the Ukrainian insurgent army. The War, Episode 15, Korsun-Shevchenkivsky Operation. At the end of 1944, following operations carried out at the interface of the First Ukrainian Fronts, Commander General Mykola Vatutin, and the Second Front, Commander General Ivan Konyev, in the area of Korsun-Shevchenkivsky, there appeared a salient which prevented the Soviet troops from advancing to the southern Bug River. As early as December, Field Marshal Manstein had suggested withdrawing part of the troops from that area. This would have prevented a big force of Wehrmacht from being encircled by Soviet troops. But Hitler didn't follow the advice. The Soviet command ordered to cut off the salient. According to the plan, the First and the Second Ukrainian fronts were supposed to launch massive counterattacks on the baseline of the salient in the direction of Zvenihorodka, encircle the German forces and destroy them. The Soviet troops that took part in the operation numbered 27 rifle divisions, 1 mechanized and 4 tank corps. That was 255,000 men, 5,300 cannons and mortars, 513 tanks and self-propelled gun mounts, and 772 warplanes. According to Soviet sources, the enemy had 14 divisions, including 1,000 warplanes, 3 tank brigades and 1 motorized brigade. That was 170,000 men, 2,600 cannons and mortars, 310 tanks, and 6 assault guns. The top of the salient ran into the Dnipro in Kharkiv region. Its width at the baseline was 130 kilometers, and the total area of the salient was about 10,000 square kilometers. General Vatutin ordered the troops to break through the enemy defense line on the 15-kilometer Tynyanka-Kosheve sector. The Second Ukrainian Front troops were supposed to break through the 19-kilometer Verbivka-Krasnosilka sector and continue the attack on Shpola and Zvenihorodka. The weather was bad during the preparations and operation itself. The thaw that had begun too early and the spring impassability of roads complicated the movement of troops. Airfields with dirt runways were rendered unusable because of bad weather. The attack of the Second Ukrainian Front began on the 24th of January. Artillery and small groups of storm troops supported the reinforced advanced battalions. By sudden attack, they broke enemy's resistance on the front line, and by the end of the day, they had moved 6 kilometers forward. There was a chance to get the main strike force of the front to take part in the battle and follow up on the success achieved, but the headquarters didn't risk changing the original plan of the operation. This made it possible for the enemy to move their forces to the breakthrough sector from other directions. It was only in the morning of January the 25th that the main forces could be engaged in the battle. The air force was unusable because of bad weather. That was why the Soviet troops ran into stiff resistance from the enemy. The forces of the First Ukrainian Front started their attack on the 26th of January. Suffering heavy losses, they managed to advance by 2 to 5 kilometers a day. On the 28th of January, an advanced detachment of the 6th Tank Army reached Zvenihorodka. It united with the 20th Tank Corps of the 5th Tank Army that was on the offensive from the south. Thus, on the 4th day of the operation, the enemy force that included 80,000 troops was encircled. Artillery General Wilhelm Stemmermann took command of the German force. Hitler ordered him to hold out to the last. The Soviet armies formed external and internal encirclement fronts. Combat engineers laid about 40 mines in the areas vulnerable to tank attacks. German troops made several attempts to break through to the encircled, but failed. The besieged Germans stood fast. They rejected an ultimatum issued on the 8th of February 1944, which demanded that they surrender. On the 11th of February, the headquarters of the German Group of Armies South made the last attempt to run the blockade, having sent 7 tank divisions to the battle. This time they also failed, but Stemmermann's troops that had started the attack from the center of the ring managed to cut down the distance to their troops up to 10 or 12 kilometers. At that time, the encircled troops occupied only 3 settlements: Shenderivka, Khilki and Komarivka. In that situation, Manstein ordered Stemmermann to push on in the southwest direction. They decided to do it with 3 columns along the 4.5-kilometer front line. Having run out of ammunition, they abandoned their artillery. Staff documents and personal belongings were destroyed. The wounded, who were not transportable, were left with medical staff to the enemy's mercies. The situation climaxed on the 17th of February, when the remains of enemy forces made the last attempt to run the blockade. Crowded together in the area near Shenderivka, under the cover of darkness and blizzard, almost without any shots fired, the encircled Nazi troops dashed towards the position of Rifle Division 180. Only a small group of tanks and armored personnel carriers, with generals and senior officers, managed to break through. Before this, Hitler's headquarters had evacuated about 3,000 German soldiers and officers. German losses in the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation numbered 82,000 dead and about 20,000 captured. For efficient command of the operation, Soviet Army General Konev was given the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union. The War, Episode 17, the Lviv-Sandomir Operation. While the Soviet troops were gaining ground in Belorussia, the situation at the rear of German Group of Armies, northern Ukraine, was getting increasingly unfavorable to the Nazi. As a result, by mid-July 1944, the 1st Ukrainian front troops were able to assume the offensive. By the end of April, in the occupied regions of Ukraine and southeastern regions of Poland, there were 11 partisan formations and 40 detachments, numbering 12,600 people. Prior to the Soviet troops' offensive, the guerrillas had caused a month-long disruption in the German railway traffic on Lviv-Warsaw and Rava-Ruska-Yaroslav section and destroyed 13 big enemy garrisons. The powerful group of armies northern Ukraine consisted of 34 infantry, 5 tank and 1 motorized divisions and 2 infantry brigades. That amounted to 900,000 troops, 6,300 guns and mortars, and 900 tanks and assault guns. They were supported by 700 warplanes of the 4th Air Fleet. Holding Lviv was clearly a priority for Germans. The 1st Ukrainian front forces consisted of 80 divisions, 10 tank and mechanized corps, and 4 tank and mechanized brigades. At the beginning of the operation, the front forces numbered 1,110,000 troops, 16,100 guns and mortars, 2,050 tanks and self-propelled gun mounts. The land forces were supported by the 2nd Air Force Army. In addition, the front forces had 3,250 aircraft. Concentration of such a great number of troops and weaponry on one front was not accidental. It was the only operation during the war when forces of one front only were tasked to destroy a group of enemy armies. In the morning, on July the 13th, forward detachments of the 3rd Guard and the 13th Armies launched an offensive in the direction of Rava-Ruska. By the end of the following day, the enemy defense line was broken through 15 to 20 kilometers deep. In Lviv direction, the armies which had started their offensive on July the 14th didn't manage to complete the breakthrough in time. Moreover, on July the 15th, the enemy launched a massive counterattack from a direction south of Zolochev. In Lviv direction, the 60th Army fractured the enemy defense line with only 1 rifle corps. Thus, a narrow corridor was formed, 4 to 6 kilometers wide and up to 18 kilometers long. On July the 16th, the 3rd Guard Tank Army entered the corridor, followed on July the 17th by the 4th Tank Army. Engaging two tank armies on such a narrow land strip, while defeating massive enemy counterattacks on the flanks, was the only operation of this kind in the history of the Great Patriotic War. By the end of July the 18th, having ruptured the enemy's defense on a 200-long stretch, the 1st Ukrainian front forces moved 50 to 80 kilometers forward and rounded up 8 divisions in the area of Brody. On July the 17th, the front troops made a forced crossing of the southern Bug and marched into Poland. On the 18th of July, a left flank formation of the 1st Belarusian front passed to the offensive from Kovel region in the direction of Lublin. By the end of July the 23rd, on the front's right wing, the 13th and the 1st Guard tank armies, together with General Baranov's mechanized cavalry group, had reached the Sian River and occupied a bridgehead on the western bank near Yaroslav. The attempts of Soviet tank armies to capture Lviv by attacks from the south proved unsuccessful. Within 3 days, the 3rd Guard tank army, following up on the success of the right front, carried out a 120 kilometers march maneuver, outflanking Lviv from the north. On the 24th of July, they approached Yavoriv and launched simultaneous offensives into opposite directions, towards Lviv and Peremysl. On July the 22nd, at dawn, the 4th Tank Army reached the southern outskirts of Lviv and engaged in street fighting. The 60th Army attacked from the east. Trying to avoid encirclement, the enemy's garrison started to retreat to the southwest. On July the 27th, Lviv was liberated. Soviet troops rapidly advanced to the Vistula. At the same time, part of the forces moved to the Carpathians. On July the 29th, the forward units of the 3rd Guard and the 13th Armies, together with the 1st and the 3rd Guard tank armies, reached the Vistula and, despite fierce resistance from the enemy, crashed the river on the run near Baran. On August the 4th, the command of the front engaged the fresh 5th Guard Army, which overran the eastern bank of the Vistula and crossed over to the Sandomir bridgehead. By that time, the 4th Tank Army, a few rifle corps, artillery and engineering units had been deployed there. By the end of the month, the bridgehead had been enlarged up to 20 kilometers along the front line and 50 kilometers deep. The German northern Ukraine group of armies was routed. 32 divisions lost 50 to 70% of manpower and 8 divisions were annihilated. 160 people who distinguished themselves in the battle were given the rank of Hero of the Soviet Union. Colonel Ivan Yakubovsky, Colonel Vasily Arkhipov and Major Arseny Vorozheikin were awarded the 2nd and Colonel Alexander Pokryshkin the 3rd Golden Star medals. The offensive in the Carpathians was resumed in October 1944. Shortly afterwards, the last of Ukraine's occupied territories were liberated. The city of Uzhhorod was freed on the 27th of October. The War, Episode 18, Belgrade Operation. In late September 1941, the 3rd Ukrainian Front forces, commanded by Marshal Tolbukhin, reached the border between Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, near the town of Vidin. According to Yugoslavian sources, in September of 1944, the National Liberation Forces numbered about 400,000 people. They were organized in corps, divisions, brigades and resistance groups. Before the Soviet troops came, the Yugoslavian National Liberation Army had repelled 7 large-scale attacks of the enemy and thereby expanded the borders of the territory liberated from the Nazi. Apart from political support, the Soviet Union provided Yugoslavia with logistical aid. From May to September 1944, a special aviation division delivered 920 tons of supplies for Yugoslavian resistance forces: arms, ammunition, clothing, footwear, communications facilities and medicines. As the Soviet troops reached the Yugoslavian border, the logistical support intensified. The British and US governments began assisting Yugoslavian partisans in 1943. In summer of 1944, Winston Churchill insisted that Joseph Broz Tito should agree to English troops landing in Yugoslavia. But due to military and political developments, the British could not land on the Adriatic shore before the Red Army accomplished its mission in Yugoslavia. It was only in May of 1945 that the British breached the area near Trieste. Despite operational success of Yugoslavian partisan, the main cities, essential railroads and motorways had been controlled by the Nazi until September of 1944. In early September, combating on the Balkan Peninsula, where the German Army E Group, commanded by Colonel General Alexander Lehr, and the F Group, led by Field Marshal General Maximilian von Weichs. Von Weichs was also the commander-in-chief of all Nazi Southeastern Army groups. The E and F groups included 20 divisions and 7 brigades. There were also units of Serbian, Croatian and other fascist governments. Having defeated the southern wing of the German force on the Eastern Front, the Soviet troops were advancing towards the Balkans. That's why Hitler had to order an immediate withdrawal of the E Army Group from Greece, Albania and southern Yugoslavia to Hungary via Belgrade. In early September, Broz Tito appealed to the Soviet Union for the Red Army to enter Yugoslavia. With the Red Army at the Bulgarian-Yugoslavian border, Hitler's troops in southern Balkans faced the threat of being cut off. The Serbia group of German army, deployed in eastern Serbia, was ordered to strengthen defense along the Serbian-Bulgarian border and secure troops' evacuation from the south of Balkans. The Germans attached special importance to holding the Saloniki-Belgrade Railroad. Engaged in the Belgrade operation were forces of the 3rd Ukrainian Front and the subordinate Danube Flotilla, as well as units of the 2nd Ukrainian Front, Bulgarian and Yugoslavian troops. In total, the forces numbered 660,000 men, armed with 4,477 cannons and mortars, 421 tanks and self-propelled artillery units, and 1,250 aircraft. The enemy had 150,000 troops, 2,130 cannons and mortars, 125 tanks and other artillery units, and 352 aircraft. On September the 28th, the 57th Army assumed the offensive, making the main attack from Vidin in the direction of Belgrade. The Allied forces encircled part of the Army Group Serbia near Negotin and defeated it by the 4th of October. Supported by the National Liberation Army of Yugoslavia, the 46th Army of the 2nd Ukrainian Front dislodged the enemy from the Yugoslavian left bank of the Tisa and Danube rivers. On October the 12th, the 4th Guard Mechanized Corps attacked Belgrade. Having overcome the enemy's resistance south of Belgrade, on October the 4th, the Corps approached the city and engaged on the outskirts. But part of the forces had to be used to defeat the 20,000-strong enemy unit routed up east of Belgrade. That is why the fight for complete liberation of the city took until October the 19th. On October the 20th, the Yugoslavian capital was finally freed. During the operation, the German Army Group Serbia was totally routed, while the defeated army groups E and F suffered heavy losses, up to 100,000 dead and captured. Most of Serbian territory was liberated. The Soviet government continued rendering assistance to the Yugoslavian peoples in their fight against the invaders. In 1944, delivered to Yugoslavia were 264 aircraft, 65 T-34 tanks, over 3,000 cannons and mortars, 6,394 light, heavy and anti-aircraft machine guns, 5,456 submachine guns, over 5,300 rifles and carabines, as well as other equipment. The War, Episode 19, Balaton Operation. On March 6, 1945, Hitler launched a counter-offensive right at the heart of Hungary, near Lake Balaton. It lasted for exactly 10 days. Historians called this operation Balaton Defense and estimated it to be one of the most fierce tank battles of the Great Patriotic War. Despite the direct threat to Berlin, in the spring of 1945, the German command decided to make the main attack on the Red Army in Hungary. Germans planned to dislodge Soviet troops and drive them back to the other bank of the Danube, fighting off the threat to Vienna and German southern districts. Besides, in the area of Balaton, there were some of the very few oil deposits accessible to Germans. Without them, the Nazi military aviation and armored forces would be paralyzed. In Hungary, Germans mustered nearly 900 tanks, a considerable number of motorized infantry and about 800 aircraft. Their intention was to force the Soviet troops back across the Danube and secure stability of the front in this region. To reinforce the attack in Hungary, the German troops were beefed up with the 6th Tank Army of SS, led by Joseph Dietrich, relocated from the Western Front, Ardennes region. German and Hungarian units, readied for the attack, were a formidable force, which outnumbered the Red Army in manpower and tanks. The Soviet forces taking part in this operation had 400,000 troops, 7,000 cannons and mortars, 400 tanks and self-propelled artillery units, and 1,000 aircraft. The German and Hungarian forces had 430,000 troops, 5,600 guns and mortars, 900 tanks and assault cannons, and 850 aircraft. Having received information about German troops preparing for the attack, the Soviet command temporarily postponed offensive upon Vienna. The order was issued to assume a defensive in this sector, cause enemies heavy losses, and launch a counter-attack. In early March, in the zone of probable hostile attack, the 3rd Ukrainian Front troops, commanded by Marshal Tolbukhin, created a depth-disposed 3-lane defense with anti-tank capabilities. Germans started the attack during the night of March 6, 1945. The main blow fell on the 30-kilometer strip between Lakes Balaton and Valency. There were also 2 less intensive attacks, one from south of Balaton towards Kaposhvar and the other one from the Drava south bank towards the Pechora. After 10 days of fierce fighting, the attackers advanced by 15 to 30 kilometers. The Germans had some 50 to 60 advancing tanks per 1 kilometer. Especially numerous were heavy tanks, Royal Tigers and Panthers. Battles raged around the clock. Counting on low efficiency of Soviet artillery at night, the Germans continued their attack in the dark, using night vision equipment. But the strong defense line prevented the Germans from breaking through to the Danube. Besides, they had no augmentation reserve and were forced to re-engage the same exhausted troops throughout the offensive. The German main attack force, operating east of Balaton Lake, lost 40,000 men and about 500 tanks, which is more than a half. By the evening of March the 15th, the Germans had stopped the offensive. On the 20th of March, fighting in the south also ceased. There, the enemy had lost almost all of its tanks, half of the aircraft, and more than 15,000 men. Having exhausted all of its assault capabilities, the German command started a hurried retreat of its troops to the Austrian border. On the 16th of March, the 3rd Ukrainian Front Army launched a counter-offensive towards Vienna. By the 23rd of March, they had crossed Mounts Vertesh and Bakoń and, pursuing the enemy, reached the area west of the town of Veszprém. The battle near Balaton Lake was the last large-scale offensive operation of the German army in the Second World War. The War, Episode 22, Prague Operation. After Berlin was captured, it was necessary to defeat the remaining large group of Nazi forces deployed in Czechoslovakia. Speaking on the 5th of May, Gross Admiral Donitz, who headed the German government after Hitler's death, stated, My primary task is to protect Germans from being mowed down by the attacking Bolsheviks. Only to this end do we continue the hostilities. Deployed in Czechoslovakia was the Center Army Group, including up to 54 divisions and 6 battle groups, and commanded by General Field Marshal Schörner. This powerful group confronted the troops of the 1st, 2nd and 4th Ukrainian fronts. In western Czechoslovakia, the Allies met with resistance from the German 7th Army, which included 5 divisions. The total strength of German forces in Czechoslovakia was 900,000 troops. They were armed with 9,700 cannons and mortars, 1,900 tanks and assault guns, and 1,000 aircraft. The Donetsk government meant to surrender to Western allies and quickly turn its almost 1 million-strong army against the Soviet troops. It was in those days that Churchill ordered Field Marshal Montgomery to collect German weaponry, so that it was ready to be distributed among German soldiers, with whom they would have to cooperate if the Soviet offensive continued. The American command was determined to occupy western Czechoslovakia and capture Prague. On the 4th of May, Eisenhower addressed the Chief of Red Army Staff, General Antonov, proposing that American troops advance to western banks of the Vltava and Elbe rivers and occupy Prague. The proposal ran counter to the Crimean Conference decision on the borderline of the Soviet and American troops meeting in Czechoslovakia. General Antonov categorically stated that the Red Army was able to carry out the mission on its own. Only then did the American armies stop at the Karlovy Vary, Plzeň, České Budějovice line. In early May, in Czechia, an uprising broke out, which primarily developed in Prague. By morning of May the 6th, about 1,600 barricades had been set up in the city. Fighting at them were up to 30,000 insurgents. Playing for time, the Nazi governor Frank started negotiations with the rebels. Meanwhile, Schörner ordered his troops to suppress the uprising by any means. German troops started out to the city from 3 directions: the Reich Armored Division from the north, the Viking Armored Division from the east, and an enforced regiment of the Reich Division from the south. Prague needed urgent support, which could be given only by the Red Army. As early as May the 1st, the Soviet command ordered the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts forces